For many people, technology has become the #1 resource of getting more knowledge, skills, and many other things nowadays. That's why we are proud to provide our new mega project, Vega Digital Learning Hub, VDLH. VDLH is a digital service that helps organizations to continue their learning journeys for their employees by providing learning solutions that needed for mastering different knowledge and skills for greater performance through various updated and important topics. We are providing digital learning services like webinars, virtual simulations, online assessments, live sessions, virtual conferences and exhibitions, virtual reality, business consultation, and coaching sessions. VDLH providing tailored training topics that will help HR organizations to boost up their learning performance and engagement. We are providing personal skills, business topics, relationship skills. VDLH is providing their learning in different digital tools that will support the learning solutions with the most efficient ways to deliver a full learning experience. The #1 rule of achieving your goal is taking action, and with VDLH, we will make sure that every single action you take will be calculated, effective, and always supported by us. Start now. Contact us for more details. VDLH, Endless Learning.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Ramadan Mubarak. Please type yes in the chat box if you can hear us. That is great. That's great. Thank you. We are really excited for today. As we promised you, we are providing the webinar #4 for a series of webinars that are preparing for you as a part of our responsibilities at Vega Enterprise to help everyone to overcome this tough time. We're also proud to introduce our new mega project, VDLH, Vega Digital Learning Hub, our new digital service that will help individuals and organizations to continue their learning journeys anytime, anywhere in the world. And now, we would like to welcome our guest for our webinar for today, Mr. Mike Ross. Mike is a founder of Juniper. Mike has served in leadership roles as a member of Canadian military, a managing director of a private equity fund. Mike also worked at eBay and as a lawyer in London, New York, Boston, Tokyo, and Mexico City. In all of his roles, Mike has sought opportunities to develop outstanding leaders and facilitate the building of great organizations, whether through seminars and workshops, program design and delivery, working with practice groups and business units, or individual mentoring, coaching, and guidance. Please welcome Mr. Mike Ross.
Shukran, Mohammed. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Ramadan Kareem to everyone. I promise I won't do too much in Arabic. I know that for those of you who are Arabic speakers, we have live translation happening, but I did want to say Masal Khair and Kif Ahalkum to everybody out there. I hope that you are all very, very well. As Mohammed said, our conversation today is going to be on unconscious bias. And what I'd like to start with today is just to get a view from all of you as to where you are in your understanding of what all that means. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a very quick poll. You'll see a poll pop up that's going to ask you to rate your understanding or your knowledge of unconscious bias from a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is I've never heard this term before, and 10 is I'm a complete expert in what unconscious bias is all about. So let me start that poll. And if you can, just vote by clicking on 1 is very low and 10 is very high in terms of how familiar you are with unconscious bias. We'll give it a few minutes for people to chime in. All right, maybe about 10 more seconds. So if you have not voted, please vote now. Okay, let me end the poll. And then I hope that you guys can see that, but it seems like most people are down at the level of about 1, right? Perhaps never even heard the concept before. There's a few people who are 5s and 6s, and then we've got some people up closer to the 8s or 9s, but most people are down at the 1 level. So that's great. Those of you who are brand new to this subject, you'll learn a lot. Hopefully some of this will be interesting to you. We're going to use this in the business context, so we're going to focus on the unconscious bias in the context of business. But for those of you who are experts who have heard this before, hopefully there's something that you're going to learn as we go through. We have a chat room, as you saw. All of you chimed in with your yeses there. I promise I will leave time for Q&A at the end of this. And so if you have questions or things like that as we're going through, type them in the chat room. But what we'll do is we'll save those until the end of the conversation, and then I can answer all of the questions at the end of the presentation, if that works. If you need any help or assistance as we go through, send a note to the admins. The great, fantastic folks from Vigor will be watching the chat room very carefully. And so if there's something that you need help with, make sure you drop them a note and they'll be happy to help. All right, so let's jump into this. Now, the first thing I want to do is start with a definition. So what is unconscious bias? Unconscious bias is a bias, which is a prejudice, something that we do ahead of time. We prejudge. We have this bias, we're going to do it ahead of time, that happens automatically, outside of our control, and triggered when our brain makes these quick or assessments about people or situations, which is influenced by our background, our cultural environment, and our personal experiences. So where I want to start that, after that definition, is just a quick exercise. Here's what I want you to do. Wherever you are, I don't know how to see it, but I want you to cross your arms. Cross your arms. You're sitting there. Maybe you're standing up at a standing desk. I want you to cross your arms. Okay? Now what I want you to do is I want you to cross them the other way. So the other arm is on top. Usually for me, this arm is on top. This way, the other arm is on top. I want you to cross your arms the other way and think about how that feels. Many of you probably struggle to do it to begin with, right? How do I do this the other way? Because we've done this so many times. It's so natural for us to cross our arms in a particular way. That's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Obviously not crossing your arms, but about how we have these natural ways of doing things. We have these natural sort of predilections to particular ways of doing things. And actually, there's a whole new realm of science in psychology starting to explore how those things work. And who we have to thank for this is these two gentlemen who are Nobel Prize winners, right? Kahneman and Tversky. And Kahneman and Tversky were the ones who really started this science starting in the 1970s. They started studying this. And what they did was they came up with this theory that your mind actually has two pieces to it. There's a fast part of your mind and a slow part of your mind. And if you want to dig into this more, there's an amazing book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. And the idea is that with these two systems, our brains run at two speeds. There's this 95% of our time is an unconscious, a fast, an associative brain that runs kind of on automatic pilot. When I ask you to cross your arms, you do it without thinking. Right? You don't have to think, okay, I'm going to take my hand, I'm going to put it in here, I'm going to do this. It just happens naturally. The 5% on the other side takes effort. This means when I ask you to cross your arms the other way, you have to think about which way that's going to be, and you have to think about where you're going to put your hands, and it feels a little strange. It's indecisive, right? Those of you who hesitated when I asked you to do it the second way, it was weird. It felt a little bit strange. It tends to be a lot slower, right? The speed at which you can do that is a lot slower than just the natural one. And the funny thing about this brain is that it's lazy. So this part of your brain does not like to work. And so what it's going to do is it's going to leave as much of the decision making to the 95%, to the fast part of your brain. Of course, that's good in a lot of things, right? If we had to think, we're all breathing as you're listening to this. You don't think about breathing. You don't think about expanding your rib cage and bringing air into your lungs. And if you had to think about all those things, oh my goodness, the amount of effort that would take. So in most cases, that's very good. But in some situations, it can be very dangerous. And it can be very dangerous because it forces us to make decisions that perhaps sometimes are not correct, are not the right ones. To force us to, we have these prejudices. We make these decisions in advance that we shouldn't be making. So let me give you a little bit more science on this, and then we're going to dig into some examples. So two real things here. So the first is this notion of heuristics, right? And those of you who scored higher on my poll earlier probably are very familiar with this term. But what these are simple and efficient rules that are commonly used to form opinions and make decisions. And we have them all. We all have them. We use them every single day. As we walk down the street, we're making very quick, snap decisions all the time using these simple and efficient rules. But biases are these heuristics that cause us to make mistakes. A bias is a systematic error in thinking that affects the decisions and judgments that people make. It goes back to Kahneman and Tversky and the amazing research that they did. But the fundamental idea here is that those little short mental shortcuts, those heuristics that we use, can be good, can be bad, right? That I don't have to think to breathe, fair enough, no problem. But the ones that are kind of difficult or may get in the way of us making the right decision, those are the ones we need to be wary of. Now, the bad news is that there's a lot of them. So I don't expect you to be able to read the little words on this, but what this is a kind of a codex of all sorts of biases, all sorts of different biases that exist, right? They're, biases that exist in terms of the meaning that you have. You need to act fast. What do you remember? Too much information, all this stuff. Again, you don't need to memorize all of these. So that's the bad news, is that there's millions probably of them. The good news is that there's, I would say, about 9 that in the professional context we need to be particularly wary of and particularly aware of, and we're going to run through those in the course of today. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on a few of them, and I'll give you all 9 as we go. But let's jump in with one of the ones that probably you're most familiar with. And even if you don't know that this is an unconscious bias, it's something that you're seeing on a daily basis. And this is called anchoring. And what anchoring is when I anchor you and I give you a suggestion, I give you an idea, and it makes you feel like that idea is the right answer. So a classic example of this is in negotiations or sales of items, right? When I go into the store and it shows 50% off, and it used to be $100 and now it's $50. Or in this example, it was $1,000, now it's $250. I think, what an amazing deal. What an amazing opportunity, right? And so here, what's happening is I'm being anchored. They're starting me at a certain level or at a certain price. And when I see the lower price, I think it's great. Marketers do this all day long, right? And those of you who are in marketing, you're probably very familiar with this as a marketing technique. But it's this idea of telling you, well, this used to be $9.95 and now it's only $2. That's anchoring in effect. In a professional context, what this can do is it can make it seem like, for example, if one of your employees comes to you and says, geez, boss, I think that this project's going to take me 2 months, right? Then you're probably predisposed to think it'll take 2 months rather than using your own decision-making, your own understanding to say, actually, I think that's probably closer to a week. And so anchoring is something where somebody speaks and introduces an idea to us, we tend to stick with that idea that's been introduced to us. Very important, and one of the fundamental unconscious biases that we are all victims of, right? These errors that we make, we tend to make this error systematically. The next one I want to talk about is confirmation bias. Now, confirmation bias means this situation where what I do is, rather than look at the actual facts of a situation, what I do is I confirm my beliefs, right? Things that if I look at a set of facts and I see some that are kind of, it seems like this is a good idea, and then there's other facts that tell me maybe it's not such a good idea. If I already think it's a good idea, I'm going to focus more on the facts that confirm my beliefs. Studies have shown that we are twice as likely to believe a fact that confirms our beliefs. Now, obviously, you can imagine how this happens in a professional context, but one of the places where we see this a lot is in a political context, right? It doesn't matter where you live, but these days, more and more, our politics are being kind of broken into silos. And so if you watch one particular news channel, you're going to see a whole bunch of, or a perception of facts that tend to confirm the beliefs that you already hold. And as a consequence, you're going to think that those facts are more likely to be true. confirmation bias, I think, is at the root of a lot of our political differences. In a work context, what this can mean is, let's say I'm doing some research for a project and I'm trying to decide whether it's useful for us to perhaps open a new office in a new city. If I go in with the feeling that, yeah, it would be good to open a new office in that city, again, I'll be twice as likely to understand or to kind of prize the facts that support that decision. So let's say there's something around the population is growing. Oh, that's a good sign. But if there was something that said that traffic is horrible, I'd be like, that's not as important. Again, the danger with confirmation bias is that rather than actually using just what the facts say, that sort of side piece, I'm overvaluing the intersection of the facts and what confirms my beliefs. Confirmation bias is a very, very dangerous one, and one, of course, in a work setting that we've got to be very careful for. I just wanted to highlight, obviously, as you guys saw in the chat, active participation is super important throughout this. If you have thoughts or comments or things like that you want to, just send them over in the chat. We'll get to them as we get to them. All right, the next one of these is what's called affinity bias. And there's an amazing study that was done in England on supporters of soccer teams, football teams, as we would say, right? And the things that they learned about soccer team supporters is that they are much more likely, so they created these little situations, they're much more likely where those supporters of a particular team are much more likely to help other people wearing the colors of their team. So in this situation where there's someone who has their team's colors and somebody else's team's colors, obviously, even outside of a soccer or a football game experience, they're much more likely to help that other person because they feel this connection with them. They feel this sense of affinity. This, in a work context, is an incredibly important unconscious bias to be aware of, especially when we're hiring people. Because when we're hiring people, we're looking at them, and if they sound like us, if they look like us, maybe they went to the same school as us, or maybe they have the same understanding of things as we do, we are going to be much more likely to want them to come in as opposed to someone who has different views or expresses a different perspective. Those people we're going to be a lot more skeptical of and not so sure of. That's a very dangerous thing, of course, because that diversity of opinion, that diversity of perspective is so crazily important in a professional setting. It also means that once those people are hired, we're more likely to support those folks who are similar to us, right? And so again, if we think about gender balance in workplaces, that's somewhere where that affinity bias becomes very, very important, because what happens often is that people, if you have all the executive team as male, they'll tend to support people who are also male, even though they don't want to, even though it's not like a decision they're making actively. That's why we call it an unconscious bias. It's a bias that we do unconsciously. All right, I see that there's someone in there who's a fan of Arsenal. You're probably not going to get helped by the Man United folks. The decoy effect, right? So again, a really, really common unconscious bias that, again, you guys will be able to use some of this stuff that you're learning today, even outside of your professional context, every single day. A wonderful study done in movie theaters, right? I know that everybody loves going to the movies. Hopefully, as soon as this coronavirus explosion thing is over, we'll be back at the movies. But they did a study with movie theaters, and a movie theater had a small size popcorn and had a large size popcorn. The small size was $3 and the large size was $7. Just for yourself, which one do you think people bought the most? It was the small. People, I think it was 75% of people would buy the small sized popcorn. Then what the movie theater did is they introduced this, a medium sized popcorn at $6.50. The effect of that, and this is called a decoy, right? The effect of that was that many, many, many more people bought the large size popcorn. Actually, 50% more people bought the large size popcorn once they had introduced that medium size. Why is that? Well, because the difference between $6.50 and $7 isn't that much, and I get a lot more popcorn for it. So by introducing that medium popcorn, they drove sales towards the large size popcorn. Again, in a work context, you're going to see this in the context of sort of people trying to decoy or trying to distract your attention from things that are very important, or aspects of projects that perhaps aren't working, or things like that, right? If I start a presentation, I say, I'm going to focus on the thing that really works and everything's great. I'm using a decoy effect to draw your attention away from what perhaps is where you would usually focus going in. All right. I'm going to introduce one more with a little bit more explanation, and then I'll give you all 9, and then we're going to run a quiz. So hopefully you've been paying attention. The last one, and in a work context, this is a particularly important one, is this notion of what's called conformity bias. And what conformity bias is all about is our desire to be part of the group, our desire to conform. And I'm absolutely certain that every single person on this phone call, on this webinar, has participated, has seen this happen. Conformity bias in, for example, let's say you're doing a recruiting, right? And you, your colleague, and maybe your boss are all there in that recruiting session. And after the session, you get together, and after the panel, and you're thinking about, oh, I actually like that candidate. If your boss and your colleagues say, oh, we didn't like that candidate at all, you are 10 times less likely to say something against them. You're 10 times less likely to support that candidate against your boss and your colleague. Why? Because we like to be part of the group. We want to conform. We want to be part of, we want to be understood of as playing along, as part of the team. And so the thing here that happens is that our desire to conform overwhelms our judgment, overwhelms our decision-making, overwhelms our ability to make the right decisions. In a work context, this is probably the most dangerous one. And the reason why this is so dangerous is because we tend to, in a work context, make the wrong decisions because one person in a meeting says, I think we should go this way. And then everybody, because that person has already stated that, everybody sort of goes, well, I guess that's probably right and we should, without necessarily having the courage and the willingness to stand up and say that. Question came up in the chat. Is conformity bias similar to groupthink? That is exactly right. Often people use the idea of groupthink for how conformity bias manifests itself in groups of people. I don't like using groupthink because conformity bias can also happen on an individual basis, right? It could be that, I'm talking to you and you say, I don't believe in that. I'm going to start thinking, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she's right. Maybe I should do that. Right? And so it's exactly the same as groupthink or a crowd mentality. Exactly. The people are chiming in on the chat is exactly right. It is when we operate in a way where we're sort of going along with what everybody else is saying without having our own decision making, without using our own approach, or without using our own intelligence. All right, so those are the few I want to spend a little bit more time on. We don't have a ton of time today, so I just wanted to touch on a few that we see the most. But here are the 9 that you see the most. And I'm just going to shrink myself down so you see this, right? So in a work context, the 9 that we see the most are anchoring, confirmation bias, affinity bias, decoy effect, conformity bias, and we talked about all those in a little bit more detail, and then some others, gender bias, right? I alluded to this a little bit, but there's some pretty clear gender stereotypes that we see all the time throughout conversations at work, right? And especially with organizations where historically there hasn't been that much gender balance and there's starting to be more, there tend to be quite a lot of biases around that. The halo effect is something also that actually has a big impact on conformity bias. The halo effect is the tendency to have positive impressions to carry over to one's opinion or feelings in other areas. So let's say, I don't know, I'm really impressed by the fact that this particular person who's interviewing this candidate went to Harvard. Now, the fact that they don't have any experience, the fact that they didn't do anything useful, the fact they got fired from their last job, well, the fact that they went to Harvard can sometimes trump all those things for me, right? So it's one of those things where what I see is, this is the kind of idea here in the sense of like it focuses us on the good stuff rather than focusing on the whole picture of the person. The contrasting one that I didn't include here, but it's also known as the horns effect, which is that if you see one thing that somebody does that you don't like, it may be one where you sort of focus on that bad thing more than the good thing. Attribution bias, from a personal perspective, this is something where we attribute our success to our skills and personality and our failures to external factors. Interesting enough, when we do other people, we do the reverse. So if I didn't get that promotion, well, it's because there's something wrong with all those people, right? The people who are making the decisions about who gets the promotion. If Bob didn't get that promotion, there must be something wrong with the way he works, right? Do you see how that attribution bias works improperly, right? This is an unconscious bias that causes us to think in a particular way, but to do it improperly. And then the last one is beauty bias, equating attractiveness with competence. For example, I'm sure you are all suffering from that watching me today. You're looking, look at this tremendously handsome guy. Everything he says must be right. But it's true. And they've done lots of studies, especially in a recruiting or a hiring perspective, where people who are better looking, objectively better looking, tend to get a lot more opportunities and things like that than those of us, perhaps like me, who have to suffer with the face that we were born with. All right. So I see that there's a couple of things going in the chat room. It looks like Imad and Dino are having an interesting conversation. How can we be conscious of our biases, right? So in many situations, we are not conscious of those. I would say that the tricky, the difficult, the challenging thing about unconscious biases is that almost all the time we're operating unconsciously. We're doing this unconsciously. Now you're in luck, because what I'm going to do now is, after we do our little quiz, don't worry, after we do our little quiz, I'm going to actually test you on your understanding of this. But after we do that, I'll give you some tools that you can use to make better decisions, to overcome these unconscious biases. And as Dino said, the fact remains that more than 50% of whatever you do on a day is on autopilot, much more than 50%. It's like 99.9999% to do that. All right. And then the other question that came in is, what is the most destructive type in a business environment? The answer to that is it kind of depends. What I would say is that in a business environment, what you need to do is you need to create places where people feel that they can object, they can offer a different perspective, right? Confirmation bias, affinity bias, and conformity bias and anchoring, all of those come into play together when I'm working in an organization and my boss says, we should do this project, and I know it's a horrible idea, but I don't say anything. That, I think, often in business environments is the thing that is the most dangerous. There's a great book by a guy named Laszlo Bock called Work Rules. And in it, what he did was he explains Google did a huge study throughout their organization around how they make decisions and what makes for a successful team at Google. And the reality is what they found is the most important ingredient to success is psychological safety. It's that in an organization, I need to have that safety to feel like I can question. I can say to my boss, hey, I'm not sure if that's the right answer. I'm not sure if we're going in the right way forward. And so in those situations, what we have to do is we have to create an environment where people are willing to and feel comfortable expressing a dissenting voice, right? I worked at McKinsey for many years, which is a big consulting firm. And at McKinsey, one of the most important rules at McKinsey, values of the organization, is what they call the obligation to dissent. The idea there is that if you disagree with something that's being said, you need to put your hand up and say, I'm not sure this is such a good idea. But most organizations struggle with that. It is that conformity bias. It's that tends to be a very, very difficult one, as someone pointed out in the chat. So distancing ourselves from the crowd, preserving our individuality, all very, very important things. And we're going to talk about how to overcome unconscious bias in just a second. But how are you guys feeling? Are you ready for our quiz? All right. So I'm going to ask you to, in the chat, just type in the name of the bias that's present in each of the following examples. All right, the first one. You're doing a brainstorming session, right? You come up with a great idea and you go to stick it up on the board. But your boss, who's standing behind you looking over your shoulder, says, I'm not sure about that. That's not such a good idea. Which unconscious bias is present in that when you take your idea back down and you sort of kind of shyly put it back maybe in the parking lot? What's going on there? What's happening when you are doing that? Which of those biases is happening? I'll give you another couple of seconds for people to chat in. I see a couple of things. It's interesting. Some people mentioned gender bias, perhaps because of the picture. Yes, gender bias could have something to do here. Yes. Affinity as well. Yes, you could have an affinity in the sense that you want to be part of this, but the real one is this notion of conformity bias. It's your views being swayed by other people. It's the fact that that boss said, I'm not so sure about that. That really gets in the way of our ability to be creative. Now, the interesting thing here is that when you are doing brainstorming, which we've all done, one of the things that make brainstorming very, very unsuccessful is conformity bias. We're going to end up with much less quality ideas if we allow our views to be swayed by other people. So as you are doing it, if you want to deprogram your mind, I know that somebody used that in this chat room, you have to think about that. And we're going to talk about how to deprogram your mind in just a second, but you've got to put in actual structures or processes to do that. If we had more time, I'd be going into all sorts of details about each one of these and how to overcome them, but I'll give you some overarching tools in just a second. But let's continue with our quiz. Okay, you're going to recruit somebody, right? And you go outside and you look, these are the lists, these are the candidates who are waiting outside to come into the interview room to be interviewed. The guy in the middle looks a lot like your brother. Huh, hey, that guy looks exactly like my brother Mohammed. Well, interesting. What's going to happen when you interview these people and how you're going to treat that guy differently, right? What's that a consequence of? What bias is happening here? I'll give you a second to think about it and to chime in. I see that a couple of people have already got it. Exactly. Affinity bias. You unconsciously prefer people who share qualities with you or someone like you that you admire. There's a lot of really interesting stuff. And again, if we had more time, we could do some more of these exercises. But one of the exercises to do for yourselves, if you want to think about overcoming affinity bias, would be to say, when you need advice, right? Let's say you're deciding, should I take a new job or should I leave my current job or should I move or whatever it is? When you need advice, think of the 6 people that you would ask for advice from, right? Think of those 6 people. Try and think to yourself, who are the 6 people that I would ask for advice from? And now what I want you to do is think about how many of those people are very different than you. They come from a different background, are a different gender, maybe from a different country, went to different schools, work in a different industry, all those kind of things. And what we could do, again, if we had more time, is put up a little sheet of that. And what you would find is that for most of us, most of the people that we would go and ask advice of are very much like us. They went to similar schools. They come from similar families. They have similar structures. They have similar jobs, things like this. That's an affinity bias. We go off and we seek advice from people like us, but there's a real danger there because those people are going to tell us stuff that we already know rather than somebody telling us a completely different view, a blind spot perhaps that we might have. All right, last quiz question. They've done studies that show that in a meeting, women who are in those meetings are 75% more likely to be asked to fetch a coffee or get some more water or maybe, I don't know, clear the table or something like that. Even if they're executives, which bias is present in that situation? Should be a fairly easy one. Remember, women are asked 75% more of the time to fetch the coffee and get the water. Again, even if they're colleagues, right? The same level. I kind of gave it away. Exactly. It's gender bias, right? It's something that comes in all the time, and it's something that we see a lot regardless of what organization we work in. And I think for many organizations, it's a really, really big problem. Because the reality is that without that balance, without that diversity of genders, of races, of things like that, of perspectives, what we're going to get is we're going to get the same idea over and over and over again. And so as we are fighting against those unconscious biases, we need to think about how do we overcome them and do it in such a way that's going to help our organizations be as strong, come up with the right decisions, have the really most creative and interesting ideas as possible. All right. I'm going to go for another poll question. And here's my another poll question. How many decisions do you think you make in a day? We're going to run the poll and we'll see what you think. Do you guys see the poll there? Now I'm going to warn you, I did a little bit of anchoring here. All right. So the poll results, and I realized that I hadn't clicked the thing, but the poll results are 41% of you said between 0 and 100. 22% said 100 to 200. 19% said 200 to 1,000. And 15% said 1,000 or more. The right answer? 35,000. We make 35,000 decisions every day. Now, the question you would be asking is, no, there's no way I do that, right? Maybe I choose my clothes, maybe I choose what to have for breakfast. But the reality is we're making decisions every single moment of our days, all the time. Now, did you notice my anchoring there? By giving you 3 poll questions or 4 poll questions that were less than 1,000 and 1 greater than 1,000, I anchored you in that top level. If I had said, if my poll had been 0 to 5,000, 10,000 to 20,000, 30 to 40,000, or 40,000 or more, I bet you a lot more of you would have gotten it right. Why? Because I'm anchoring you, right? So that's a great example of a place where you have to be able to think about and overcome an unconscious bias. If somebody asks you, is it A, B, C, or D, realize that you're being given a false choice, right? You're being given a choice between 4 options, but maybe there's a 5th option that they're not even suggesting. Okay, I know that you guys are interested in knowing this, and here we go. So how do we avoid traps in decision making? This is the really important stuff. And the 2 things to do is to follow a process and to log and review your decisions. We humans, as I said, we have that animal brain, right? That fast part of our brain that makes almost all of our decisions in a day. We need to train that to work better, to overcome these unconscious biases, especially in a professional context. And so there's 2 big tools to use here. And I'm going to introduce these very, very quickly. And then we're going to do the Q&A at the end. But there's lots more to be read and lots more to be dug into on this. But tool number 1 is to follow a process, especially for very important decisions. And the second is to log and review your decisions. So the process that I love the most, if you want to think about a good process, is this notion called the WRAP model, W-R-A-P. And this was introduced by a couple of guys named Chip and Dan Heath, H-E-A-T-H. You can buy a book. There's a book called the WRAP model. And the idea here is that we take 4 plus an extra big steps every time we have to make a very big decision. The first step is we widen our options, right? Remember I said if somebody says it's A, B, C, or D, you should always ask yourself, is there another option, right? We can either close the plant or we can keep it running. Well, maybe there's another option of doing a JV with somebody, or maybe there's another option of et cetera, right? Sharing some of the plant capacity with another competitor. There's all sorts of different ways of approaching a problem. The first thing we need to do is take off those kind of blinders and open our perspective as to what's actually possible. The second one, which is to reality test our assumptions. The idea here is that what we want to do is we want to question everything. Why is it that I want to hire that person? Is it because they remind me of my brother? Is it because they're the same gender as me? Why is it that I think that that person wouldn't be as good a candidate? Is it because I don't understand where they come from or something like that, right? I should be testing these. Now that I've introduced those 9 unconscious biases for you, you can keep that cheat sheet that we're going to offer you at the end and kind of ask and say, am I operating under these biases? The third thing is to attain distance. It's to not make that decision about me, but to say, if I was giving advice to somebody else, what would I suggest they do? This can be very powerful. I'm sure many of you have had this happen in your own life when you've been trying to make an important decision and you go and you ask somebody and they tell you a piece of advice and you're like, I should have thought of that. I would have known that. But because we're dealing with ourselves, because we're thinking about our own problems, we don't have that distance that's necessary to decide. And then the last one is to prepare to be wrong. We tend to be very confident in our own decision-making, our own conclusions. And so especially in a business context, we should be developing mitigation strategies, ways to think, if we are wrong in this, how are we going to fix it? This is the WRAP framework. Widen your options, reality test your assumptions, attain distance before deciding, and prepare to be wrong. Now, the last one that's not part of that framework, but ties into what we're going to talk about now, is to learn and adapt. Learning and adapting is all about making sure that we are improving our decision-making as we go. Some of us are much less victims of gender bias, for example. Some of us are much less victims of conformity bias. We all have biases that are stronger for us and weaker for us. We need to figure that out. And so the way that I de-bias myself, the way that I cure myself of this, is by three things. The first is I diagnose. I look at past decisions, especially mistakes, and I think, where did I make that mistake? I hired the wrong person. What was I confused about? Well, they had gone to Harvard, and so I ignored all the other information that would have told me probably not a good idea to hire them. And so if that's the case, then what I want to do is next time when I see somebody who has a good school pedigree, I'm going to say, am I falling victim to that same bias again? I need to diagnose for myself where my own particular biases lie. I need to design. So there what I do is I say, okay, how can I overcome that? And so maybe, for example, I know that in recruiting, I have this clear bias around brand names on someone's resume. Well, maybe what I do is I don't look at their resume before I interview them. Or what I do is I give the resume to somebody else in my team and I say, I want you to give it back to me, but I want you to cross out, so I can't read them, the names of all the fancy companies and schools that they went to. Whatever it is. And again, we could go through all sorts of designs of ways to overcome those unconscious biases, but the idea is to come up with a creative way to overcome it for myself on a recurrent basis, to catch myself before I make those errors. And then the last thing, of course, is to use those tools, implement those mechanisms. That be as simple as just making sure I take a step back and I think about a decision before I make it. In a recruiting context, one of the things we often advocate to our clients is that if you have, let's say, a boss and 3 peers, make sure that the boss talks last. So if like, oh, how did you find the interview? The boss should wait until everybody has spoken before the boss expresses him or herself. What bias is that going to help us overcome? Conformity bias, right? If the boss goes first, everybody else is going to be like, yeah. What she said, I agree. Whatever she said is right. Whereas if the boss goes last, it's a simple little trick to help overcome that conformity bias in a professional context. Or in a brainstorming, for example, you may want to have the team do the brainstorming by themselves and then have the boss come in afterwards so that they can't see his or her face as, what? That was a bad idea, things like this. Let them do their work and then have the boss review it. These mechanisms don't have to be very complex, but they do have to be targeted to the particular biases that are in place. All right, I've got 9:44. And so I think what we're going to do is we're going to switch to some key takeaways and some Q&A. And I just want to show you, before we jump into that Q&A, that we are going to leave you with a cheat sheet. So if you didn't catch everything I said or things like this, you're going to get a copy of the cheat sheet. Again, I think so long as you fill in the survey afterwards. But let's jump into the Q&A now and see what questions you have. Feel free to type them in on the chat room, and I'll answer as many as I can with the time that we have. And maybe if you guys can help us with the questions that come from the Arabic language group, I'll answer them obviously in English, and then أنا بكري شوي شوي عربي, but not enough to answer questions.
That's great, Mike. So we have a question here from Dr. Ahmed Bouzer from the state of Kuwait. He's asking how to determine the 35,000.
Good question.
I think he's...
Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
To tell you the truth, Doctor, I'm not a decision scientist. I think it was a team at Harvard that did that research that came up with 35,000 decisions. I think what they did was they tracked people and watched them make actions and do the things, and they saw them make all those decisions, right? Imagine, for example, Doctor, if you're driving in your car, right? So you drive from your home to your office every single day, correct? But every time you drive, you're making thousands of decisions as you're driving. Should I speed up? Should I slow down? Should I try and make this light? Should I turn here? When do I turn my turn signal on? When do I not? All those sorts of things. All of those are micro decisions that you're making. Now, I cheated a little bit in including that 35,000 number because, of course, that includes all those unconscious decisions we're making every day. But the reality is that those unconscious decisions are very dangerous, right? And of course, in a driving context, it would be impossible for me to be so focused all the time on everything I'm doing. But actually, I can actually get to the point where I know the key here is to know what are the things that I should allow to work automatically. And there's other things that I should allow to work unautomatically. I hope that answers the question.
That's great. So we have another question here from Dr. Yusuf, how to deprogram our mind.
So the deprogram our mind essentially is, and let me just go back in the slides a little bit, it's this. How do you deprogram your mind? You start by figuring out where your particular weaknesses lie. Which are the biases that you yourself are particularly susceptible to, right? So for example, there's somebody who came in the chat and said, I think confirmation bias is the one that I'm really susceptible to. How do I overcome that? So once I've diagnosed that I have a problem in a particular bias, then I design a method of overcoming it. And so that confirmation bias may be, I develop a scoring system, right? So every time I find a fact that supports my idea, I give it a check mark. One that doesn't, I give it an X. Rather than using my brain to sort of weigh those facts, I do it in a more tactical, deliberate manner. And then I implement that process. And I have to be always, in a way, we've done this slide wrong because it's not just a sort of a series of actions, it's a loop. I've got to keep coming back to this, keep coming back and testing my decisions. What were the decisions where I made mistakes in the past? What mistake did I make? What bias was present? Why is it that that happened in that way? And then how do I fix it? As people who run organizations, that design structure can be something around how do we run the meeting? Perhaps the problem with our organization is that we have a really strong conformity bias, right? So that as soon as the boss says, well, I think we should go this way, everybody just nods and says, yes, 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 boss. Perhaps in a meeting, what I could do is I could assign a person a role of what we call the devil's advocate. And the devil's advocate, their job is to argue against everybody else, whether they believe it or not. Their job is to think of all the reasons why this is a bad idea and state them. That's a very powerful role to have in an organization because that person will question everything and force you to defend it. Now, the thing about that, of course, is that people don't want to do it because they don't want to get the boss mad at them. But if I make it a structural thing, I'm going to say, Bob, today your role is, okay, everybody, let's discuss. Bob knows I'm not going to blame him for questioning my ideas. I'm going to support him because he's doing what he should be doing. And so how we deprogram our mind, there isn't a lightning, one switch or something we could drink or anything like that. It's the practice of going through this. And again, given more time, we could go into a lot more details on each of those biases and some of the tools and techniques that we have to deprogram them.
That's great. That's great. We have another question from Fahad. He's saying, how can I change the mindset of a group I know they are not in the same page with me?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I mean, I think the way to start is make sure they see a training like this, right? So get them in contact with Vigor and they can find that out for them. But what I would say is to change the mindset of a group, right? The first thing to do is to be aware of the biases that that group has. If this is a group that has a very strong confirmation bias, or maybe they have a gender bias, or maybe they have a conformity bias or something like this. For example, let's say you have a group that has conformity bias and gender bias, right? So they tend to be very conformist. They tend to do they all want to move in the same direction, but they also think perhaps that, women are not as capable in the workplace or something like this. Well, one of the things you could do is you could use that conformity bias against the gender bias. How? By showing, hey, we've done studies or showing them some of these studies at great organizations. Think of organizations that group would see as being amazing, right? Let's say Amazon or Google or Facebook. And show how they've done these studies that show in those organizations, having more women in executive roles has shown great, tremendous outperformance. Okay, we want to conform with those fancy people, but then that conflicts with my gender bias. Maybe I can use this one to trump that one, to overcome it. Everybody's biased, but being aware and opening your eyes to these biases means that you can use them in an effective way to help people make the right decisions. You can help people make sometimes the wrong decisions in the sense that if you're negotiating something, like, I don't know, the price of a house or the price of a car, right? You know, if you go to the price, have you ever seen these things that say manufacturer's suggested retail price is, I don't know, 100,000, and then it's crossed off and we're selling it for 70,000? That's anchoring. So be careful in your life to keep your eyes open to these unconscious biases. You're going to start to see them everywhere, and you'll start to deprogram your mind, and then you can use them against those groups, or with those groups, I guess I should say, to help them overcome the biases.
That's great. So another question from Fanar Shab. The question is, how do you follow the debiasing process if your previous judgment are usually always right?
Right. And I saw that there's an example there in recruiting of hiring someone who's a bachelor's degree holder is usually always of higher caliber than a high school degree holder. That's a fact, right? And that's not a bias necessarily, right? The people who have a bachelor's degree tend to be better than people who have high school degrees. I think that's fair. But I will tell you this, right? Let's take a fact, which is the people who have better scores in school, right? We should hire the people with the higher grades. Google now, again, one of the leaders in sort of overcoming these things, doesn't accept grades in their application process. They don't want to know what your grades were. Why is that? Because they thought that that was a fact, but then they went back and they did the research and they found that actually those people who didn't necessarily have the greatest grades, but had all sorts of other things on their resume or their curriculum or their CV, ended up being better performers than the ones who were very, very good at school and very good at getting good grades, but maybe didn't have the skill set that was necessary. So I guess, Fanar, my answer to that would be, you have to be very susceptible. You have to be very suspicious of things that you think are facts to make sure that you're not just confirming your own biases. Now, once you've established that it actually is a fact, that's totally fine, of course. But I would say things like, you know, for example, and I'm going to be very careful here, the idea that women aren't as good in the workplace as men, if we went back 50 years, I think there's a lot of people would say that's a fact. There's a lot of people that would say that is a proven thing. Of course, they were completely wrong. And so be very careful with the things that you assume are absolutely true. Now, if it is true, great. And if that's something, you know, let's say for hiring into a particular role, you need somebody with experience in a particular role, that's not an unconscious bias, that's a requirement. But the danger comes in is that when you are looking at those people and you say, oh, this guy worked at this fancy company, and as a consequence, they must be more intelligent or fancier or better than those other people. All right, let's keep going.
Okay, that's great. So Ahmad is asking, any suggestions for further readings on this interesting subject?
So I would say the kind of the basic book you should read about how to think about unconscious biases is a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by a guy named Daniel Kahneman. Actually, I have it right here. Hold on one second. I'll just grab it. This is the book. I don't know if you guys can see that. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. This is the book that won him the Nobel Prize. And so that book is the basis for a lot of the understanding of unconscious bias. Now, it was written a while ago, and so the science has evolved since then, but it's a really good book to understand those two sides of your mind and how they work, and it talks a lot about unconscious biases. It doesn't go in too much in terms of the workplace per se, but it's more the science around it generally. The book that I mentioned about improving decision-making is a book called WRAP, and it's W-R-A-P, by two authors named Chip and Dan Heath. And I don't think that I have that on this bookshelf, so I won't go hunting in my house to find it. But it is a very good book about overcoming your own biases and how it is that you can correct them as you go forward.
That's great. Thank you so much, Mike. So the other question from Isra, are there basic tools or ways or rules to assure a basic or foundation of unbiased teamwork?
Yes, there's a lot. And I've mentioned a few as we went through, right? Things like the devil's advocate role, things like maybe taking the boss out of the decision making to work through something, things like this. What I would say, though, is that the fundamental thing is to talk about it. So as a team, what I would encourage you to do is, perhaps you saw this, go back to your team. Maybe you take the cheat sheet after you've done the survey, go back to your team and explain to them what you learned today. And say, I think that we have these biases and I think that we should overcome them. Just like that diagnose, design, implement structure, let's diagnose. Where is it that we have our biases? Which are the ones that are helping us and which are the ones that could be hurting us? And how do we overcome them? Then you can design structures. And again, there's all sorts of different structures you can put in place. You can design those structures that are necessary and useful to overcome those biases and then implement them. So it's essentially just the toolkit that I've given you, but share it with your teams and have that conversation around it. I'm going to leave it to you guys to figure out the timing. I'm happy to stick around for a while and answer some more questions.
That's great. We still have around five minutes, so we can just get another few questions. Is there any link between the emotional intelligence and unconscious biases?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, this is like this is a little taste of something. The emotional intelligence is all around our ability to work with other people. And the problem with unconscious bias, and in a way, there's a similar root to a lot of this stuff. And you'll see that on one of the first slides, I had a picture of an iceberg. For me, that's the greatest metaphor of the human being, because a human being is like an iceberg, right? Where there's a little bit of the stuff we see above, and there's all this stuff that happens below the water. All those unconscious biases exist below the waterline. So I don't see yours. You hear me talking, but you don't know all the biases I have. Emotional intelligence, part of emotional intelligence is our ability to understand that other people think differently than we do, that they may have different perspectives, they may have different biases than we do. And so emotional intelligence is almost the superpower that allows me to overcome this, not only in myself, but allows me to overcome this in others. So often when we talk about unconscious bias, we talk about unconscious bias, emotional intelligence, and our ability to influence others all at the same time, because they all kind of root into the same understanding of ourselves as human beings, in the sense that we have this parts of our brain that work automatically that I don't see, but also you don't see, in the sense you don't see mine. A lot of emotional intelligence, empathy, self-awareness, self-regulation, all those ingredients to emotional intelligence are part of how we can overcome our unconscious biases, but also help others overcome their unconscious biases.
Fabulous. Jalal have another question. Who is in need to correct the bias if it's okay with him or her and the business isn't affected negatively?
I mean, this goes back to that question about recruiting, right? I think that the answer should be, what I would do when you do that diagnose phase, start with the mistakes you've made, right? And if you work in a business that's never made a mistake, well then, amazing. Congratulations, right? You are the one person in the whole wide world that does, right? So start with the mistakes that you've made in the past. As a business, as a team, as a group, whatever. What are the mistakes? What are the places that we made a mistake? Then go back with that and diagnose what were the biases that forced us to make this mistake. Those are the ones you need to fix, right? There's somebody asked a question I saw in the chat room that the biases can be used to support us, right? Of course. And the thing is, marketers are using these biases against you, but in their interest all the time, right? And so you have to be aware of these, and you can use them. This is why, again, when we teach this, we teach unconscious bias, emotional intelligence, and influence. Because an awareness of unconscious bias, using emotional intelligence, then I can really influence people. And if you're in organizations, you will know that your ability to influence others is perhaps the most important skill as you move up in a leadership role. Right? It stops being about doing the nuts and bolts work and much more around influencing upwards, managing, motivating, inspiring a team, influencing them, peers, clients, all that sort of stuff. And so all of that work comes back, roots into emotional intelligence, but also has to do with your ability to understand this root of unconscious biases.
That's great. That's great. So I think we already have just one last question. Defending my ideas may expose my biases, right?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, I think that, again, like if you're working in an organization where you can't have a conversation about unconscious biases, then you probably have to be quite careful around how it is you say and what it is that you say. But hopefully, if that exposes your unconscious bias, the person you are talking to can help you identify those, and then you can fix them going forward. Right? And so, if, I don't know, we're arguing about whether we should hire that person who looks kind of like my brother, or we should hire this other candidate who doesn't look at all like me and comes from a different country and a different background and things like that. And I'm really pushing, we should hire my brother. If you're listening to me, maybe you're saying, hey, you know what? Mike has some unconscious biases around there around affinity. Maybe I could help him by saying, Mike, you should work on that affinity bias. And so again, for me, this is all about growth. It's about learning, right? This is what we're trying to do here, is that, in this case, virtual, right? Digital learning, but it's all about learning and overcoming ourselves. The person who asked the question about emotional intelligence will know that self-awareness is one of the pillars of emotional intelligence. So the thing that I would ask or suggest of all of you is, leaving this webinar, ask yourself, which are the biases that I'm the most victim of, and how can I overcome them? And maybe I'll end with that last point.
That is great, Mike. That was an informative talk and fabulous content. We appreciate your time and effort. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you. Here at Vegor Enterprise, as a partner with Mr. Mike Ross, we would like to thank you and thank him for joining us today. Please make sure to fill in the survey that will be sent to you on your registered email so you can get a copy from the webinar cheat sheet. Thank you again from Vegor Enterprise and VDLH. Ramadan Kareem. Stay safe and see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mike. Bye-bye.